Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Equity Lab. My name is Sonrisa Cooper. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a program manager here at Greenlining, where I work on systems change. We're so excited to have you here with us for day 2 of our economic summit. So the reason we call this session Equity Lab is because it's meant to be a little more interactive than your typical online panel. So we're actually calling it a roundtable. We have 2 breakout sessions happening at the same time where we'll be exploring ways to recover from the pandemic with equity in mind. I know it's really hard to feel connected when you've been sitting behind a screen for over a year. So we try to design this session so that the audience can participate. So we have invited some guests to join us today, but we've also made it possible for audience members to join the discussion. So later on, we'll invite you to hop on stage if you're interested and actually join and be a part of the panel for a few minutes. This is our first time ever trying something like this, so please be flexible and also help us out by participating in the discussion, coming on stage, and using the chat while we're talking. So as you know, the theme of this year's Economic Summit is momentum, and that's what we want to get into today. We know that we can't go back to normal when COVID is gone. In 2019, before this pandemic even started, the typical white family had 8 times the wealth of a typical Black family and 5 times the wealth of a typical Latino family. And since then, that's only gotten worse. During the pandemic, 60% of Black families, 72% of Latino families, and 55% of Indigenous families reported serious financial problems, compared to just 36% of white families. I'm sure many of us here have experienced this personally. It's just not an option for us to keep the status quo. And of course, it's not just a financial issue either. During the pandemic, we've also borne collective witness to horrendous police brutality, waves of anti-Asian hate crimes, and if you live in the American West, I don't think any of us will forget what it felt like to have wildfire smoke blocking the sun for weeks on end. And of course, we've lost millions of friends and loved ones because of a health crisis that could have been prevented if our government cared more about Black and Brown people. Things have been hard for our communities for a really long time, and we don't want to go back to that either, but we also can't forget about it. As I mentioned earlier, we're here today to talk about momentum. Things have been really, really rough, but actually not everything has been bad news. Over the past year, we've seen record voter turnout in spite of a global pandemic and efforts to suppress voters of color. We've seen an incredible swell of racial justice activism and organizing. And in general, I think we've just all really learned new ways to communicate and show how much we care about each other. So COVID will go away, but everything is going to be a little bit different after the pandemic ends. This isn't just a moment, we're part of a movement. And we need to imagine what we could do and create if we weren't afraid to think really big about how we want to change our society. Okay, so now I want to just backtrack a little bit to talk about why we need to be big and bold in our response to the COVID pandemic. So this map is probably familiar to most of you already, and you've probably seen it a lot during this conference, but this is really important. So this is the redlining map of Oakland from 1937. It was created by a government agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And on it, the red and yellow areas on the map represent neighborhoods where people of color lived. The blue and green represent the areas where white people lived. So these maps were created by the government for cities all over the country, and they were used by banks to decide where they would issue mortgages to home buyers. So residents of the red and yellow neighborhoods, that is, people of color, were effectively shut out of homeownership for decades, leading to the enormous racial wealth gap that I mentioned earlier. And now I want to show you something else. So this is that redlining map of Oakland again. This is a map of air pollution in the same area. And this is a map of where COVID-19 was hitting us worst a few months ago. They all look the same, right? So the reason these maps all look the same is because they all stem from the same root cause, which is structural racism. It's not just a housing issue. It's not an environmental issue. It's not a health issue. It's actually intersecting forms of discrimination and oppression that together form a system of structural racism. So these maps are the products of what at Greenlining we call the redlined economy. And the redlined economy is a broken economy. It is extractive of our planet. It's segregated. It doesn't protect workers. It harms our communities. The redlined economy is bad. And what we want is a just and healthy economy. And we call this a greenlined economy. This is our North Star. A greenlined economy is inclusive. It's democratic. It's cooperative. It's regenerative. And it's non-exploitative. And most importantly, a greenlined economy keeps community at the center. So I know this sounds like a pretty lofty vision, but we're actually very optimistic that we can create this. It definitely won't happen overnight. It'll take patience and resolve. And most importantly, we'll need people from every corner of our system to buy into our vision of a greenlined economy. We'll need to build power. We need to organize, educate ourselves and each other, and work in solidarity towards a greenline system. If you've been organizing for a long time, you already know this is a very long fight. And if you felt the call to action for the first time this year, please don't walk away. At the same time, we also need to make sure that policy has equity written into it. We need racial equity in the halls of power. We need funders on board with the vision. And we need to set the bar really high for what we expect from our institutions. Like I said, it'll take everybody working towards a just and healthy economy for it to take root. The past year has been awful in so many ways. We are living through a dark chapter in history, but there's also a little crack in the door with some light peeking through. And I am ready to kick the door wide open. I'm ready to talk about what's on the other side of the door and imagine what we can do to build a brighter and healthier future for our communities. So in just a little bit, we're going to get into the more exciting part of this session. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to explore what it'll take for our economy to bounce back from COVID with equity at the core. So we have two breakouts happening at the same time. One is called Building Power, and the other is called Policy in Action. You're already in one of those breakout rooms, but if you want to switch back and forth, you can do that as much as you want by clicking the Sessions tab on the left side of the screen. So in each of these rooms, we're going to have this conversation roundtable style. We've invited some incredible speakers here to talk with us about creating a just and healthy economy. Our speakers today are organizers, activists, radical thinkers, leaders in government, just all around brilliant people. And as I said, this is an interactive session, so you will also have an opportunity to jump in. We want to see your thoughts in the chat, your questions in the box, and in a little bit, you'll even have the chance to get up on stage with us and join the dialogue with the speakers if you want to. We've all sat through so many Zoom panels this year. This is different. We want you to be able to participate. So don't think of it like a Q&A. Think of it more like a conversation or coming on a talk show. So if you're feeling brave, you can raise your hand to join the discussion, and one of our moderators will bring you up on stage to join the guests. And don't feel self-conscious if you are not camera ready. We've all been there. And I promise this is a totally judgment-free zone. We just want to get more people on the mic. Like I said, we've never tried this before, so I hope you are open to trying something new together. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Brianna Wells, who's in the Building Power session, and Leslie Aguayo, who's in the Policy and Action session, and they are going to take it away with the roundtable conversations.
Thanks, Sonrisa, for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us in the Policy and Action session. My name is Leslie Aguayo. I'm a climate equity and program manager with the Greenlining Institute. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll be your facilitator today. So the theme of today's session is policy and action, And we want to use this session to galvanize the momentum of this current moment and use this momentum as policy to transform the status quo, right? We don't want to go back to what we've normally been used to. And we know that the road to recovery is multifaceted. And that doesn't just mean economic recovery. That also means climate recovery, environmental justice, racial justice, health justice, and really breaking down all of the barriers that are in the way of true equity. So we recognize that for the sessions today, we've broken them into power building and policy and action. And while that was done for the purposes of logistics for this session, we want to make sure that folks understand that these are not mutually exclusive and should work together in tandem for true change. But today we're going to be focusing on the latter. Again, we have both of the sessions, so feel free to jump back and forth as you see fit, but I will be introducing my speakers today. So I'll be joined today by Yana Garcia, who is Deputy Secretary of Environmental Justice, Tribal Affairs, and Border Relations at the California Environmental Protection Agency. We have Dr. Destiny Thomas, founder and CEO of Thriven's Project, and our very own Rawan Elhalaby, Greenlining Senior Economic Equity Program Manager. And as Sonrisa mentioned, we want to make sure that this session is a roundtable session. So we're going to keep it casual, ask folks to join us in the conversation. And we're really sure that folks are tired of the usual Zoom panels. So we're really trying to disrupt that, which means that this is an experiment. It's the first time we've done this. So if y'all can give us some grace, we've already had a couple technical difficulties this morning. That would be really, really great. I super appreciate it. And so with that, I'll go ahead and get started and turn it over to our panelists. So thank you, Destiny, Yana, and Rawan for joining us today. How are you guys feeling? Welcome to my talk show.
Hey, Leslie, thank you. I'm in a good headspace. You all are catching me mid-vacation from work, so I'm nice and fresh.
Oh, good for you, Destiny. That sounds awesome. I'm doing well. I loved that intro from Sonrisa. That was really nice.
Yeah, we'll be getting into that a little bit deeper. Well, I want to go ahead and dive right in since we only have an hour. And I want to start with a grounding question. So, because of all of this awful events that have happened in the last year, this, has created both trauma and a source of hope for folks to move forward in this moment that we're living in. But we have to make sure that moving forward, we center those that are most marginalized in policy. So I'm curious to hear, and feel free to take this, whoever wants to start, how we can ensure that recovery policies and funding, so both policy and funding, center the needs of communities of color moving forward. I'm going to go ahead and pick on someone. So I'll start with Yana.
Sure, thank you. I was super curious to hear from Dr. Thomas, but I will hear from her shortly. So I think one of the key things that we're seeing a lot more of now, but that I really hope catalyzes us into making perspective looking change is acknowledging our history, like first and foremost. And part of the reason it's refreshing to kind of walk through some of the analysis that, Sonrisa just laid out with respect to redlining, and so many other ways in which people of color in this country have been expropriated off their lands, denied access to wealth, denied access to resources, is that it's really critical for us, particularly as policymakers, as I think as civil servants in government, to understand the intentional practice of government agencies contributing to that wealth disparity and to the systemic racial disparities that we see today. So I think it's really important to recognize that history, that flow of history. It is shocking to me how many people still need to be educated in that respect. But I think taking this as an opportunity to, as people of color, it's challenging for us to always play this role and to always have to educate folks on this history. But I think we're increasing in our resources, our access to resources that people can really grab onto, and hopefully understanding that history will lead us to identifying how we prioritize then benefits, right? There's a lot of discussion around reparations, and the scope of that is really critical, and we have to be pretty precise in saying this is the history that leads to the justification for this, right? But I think that's one way in which we need to build the historical record to prioritize now our efforts and our investments in the communities that need it most.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I'd also be curious to hear, Destiny, what your thoughts are as well.
Yeah, no, Yana, you're getting at, you knew what I was going to say, exactly what I would say, which is I also believe it's important to make sure that whatever our responses are really steeped in a deep understanding of that is based on root cause analysis. At the Thrivance Group, we actually, we're an urban planning firm, so we have a framework for what we call spatial reparations, which really encompasses, abolitionist values as well as harm reduction as a baseline principle. But we have like 4 really clear elements of spatial reparations that we feel like our responses to COVID-19 can't thrive without. And so, as Jana mentioned, being able to address a specific element of harm, right, that's been identified over time through history, and those impacts show up through the legacy of slavery and racism. It's also important to identify a specific and intentional recipient of the interventions or compensation or whatever your framework for reparations is. The reason I point this out is because yes, we are all, those of us who are still low income tend to live in proximity to other people who maybe are different from us racially or ethnically. But I think we would be doing everyone a disservice if we don't have a degree of specificity when we talk about not just what kind of harm we are repairing, but who we are centering in the design and conceptualization of our interventions. And then also making sure that whatever our solutions are don't have eligibility or qualification factors that are also attached to or dependent on some other system of oppression, right? So criminalizing mobility is probably not something you want to anchor to a reparative approach. And then lastly, making sure that you're doing whatever you can to create permanent redress, and so that your solutions aren't sort of furthering or cementing even some of the things that we've come to accept as like the way we've always done it or the way it will always be, like really breaking up our inclination to do that as a field. And that's where I think abolition comes in, like imagining what it would mean to have to start with a blank canvas and not being afraid of that as a call to action.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love that. I wanted to follow up about what you meant by continual redress, but I'll go ahead and pass it to Rawan and see if you have any thoughts, Rawan.
Yeah, I mean, I was really going to emphasize what Yana and Dr. Thomas said. I think policies can center communities of color by just hearing from communities of color and being collaborative in both the development and implementation phase. And some of the principles that Sonrisa kind of touched on that are part of our Greenlined economy framework are that any policy needs to be race conscious and specific. For example, if you're a bank implementing a home ownership support program, you have to be specific about who you want to serve and tailor that program to that community's needs. And policies should directly serve communities of color. So broadly, we see more movement on indicators like the racial wealth gap when policies only target a specific community rather than when a policy like a small business grant program is available to everyone. So when they're tailored and specific, we see more movement. And another point that I want to mention is that we also need to fund organizations that are led by people of color and that are in the position to provide these critical services and to reach the communities that are most in need. So again, being specific rather than having an reaching or broad policy is really the key here, I think.
Yeah, I think that's super important, right? Like targeting who you're talking about and then having metrics to those are the folks that you actually helped. So I wonder if we can go back to the point that you made, Destiny, about the redress, right? Because so later on, I'll have a question that'll dive a little bit deeper into this, but how do you see, a society where we can sustain that continual redress? Is it something like what Rawan mentioned, where it's just consistent targeting implementation of that community, and as equity grows, you'll start to slowly pinpoint more and more specific communities, or is it a little bit broader?
I think that is it partially, but what I mean by permanent redress is a lot of the harm or the impacts of our legacy of harm in this field seem and have been accepted as permanent, right? Like, even when we get into philosophical debates, which I don't like, about what to do with the so-called street, right? There's never a conversation about what if we didn't have streets, right? Because it's unfathomable to people. So someone created an intervention or a concept that is now in our minds, for all intents and purposes, permanent, right? That same type of ingenuity, innovation, and really like that posture that's unapologetic about the solutions that we're coming up with need to be attached to our interventions, right? So we're not, to me, it is not sufficient to just meet an immediate need. You also have to completely disrupt, eliminate, dismantle the dynamics, the policies, maybe even the people who got us to this place to begin with. And then you also have to be equally as invested in creating permanent infrastructure, processes, policies that protect the communities that have been violated through our legacy of planning, up to this point. So I think when we think of these things as permanent interventions, although nothing is really permanent, it helps us to be a little bit more bold with our recommendations.
Yeah, no, thank you for explaining that to me. And I think that also, for a plug for folks, dives a little bit more into detail in your unurbanist articles and websites. So if folks are curious to hear more about what Destiny was referring to, I would suggest to have them go and look up the unurbanist research that she's done. Did I get that right?
You did. It's the Unurbanist Assembly, and it's more than just research. It's a community of multidisciplinary practitioners who help us to imagine cities and policies and practices that go beyond what we've known traditionally. And so in those conversations, there's room for us to talk about how sex workers need to use the public realm. There's room for us to talk about the beauty of creating living space that happens to also be outside, if that's the type of dignified living space folks want to choose, right? And so I think these conversations that we've kind of not been willing to have belong in this unurbanist conversation, which is really our catchy way of saying, like, what if we get rid of urbanism altogether? Like, how can we imagine being with one another in ways that serve us and dignify our existence?
Yeah, no, that's great. Go ahead, Yana.
I was going to add really quickly, Destiny, just loving the breakdown that you just gave of the concept of permanent redress. And I think one of the things that holds us back so much in the environmental and climate space is that we are full of these. And, you gave the example of a street, which is interesting because it does really seem so basic and fundamental to everybody's understanding of how we think about land use. And when we think about, offset trading, or the system through which we regulate toxics or deliver drinking water, or just water generally, we're full of these. We're full of these underlying presumed to be permanent systems that I think we're really getting to a place. And I feel like the momentum that has built up over the past couple of years, particularly in the face of ongoing climate emergencies, is contributing to this. But I hope we're getting to a place where we're able to see beyond those as permanent assumptions, right? And really think about what it could look like if we had an entirely different way of thinking about, water rights or drinking water access, regulation of toxics, air pollution, whatever it is. But it is a very challenging space to be in currently in the policy realm for how we deal with climate change and environmental issues.
Yeah, thanks for jumping in there, Yana, and expanding on that. Looking back on my own planning education and really wish that y'all had come in and given us some seminars to disrupt how we traditionally think about all of these issues. So I want to remind folks that, again, we're going to try to make this an interactive session. So in a couple of minutes, I'm going to invite some people from the audience to join us here on stage with our panelists. And in order for you to do so, you can go ahead and click on the hand raising function at the bottom of your screen. And then I'll go ahead and have our behind the scenes folks bring two of you up on stage. And you can ask our panelists questions or comments as it pertains to the topic of conversation. And then I'll go ahead and transition you back into the audience. So while folks queue up, I'm going to go ahead and ask my second question. So going back to Sonrisa's slides and addressing the inequities that redlining has created and still manifest to this day, just in more subtle ways, and our approach to greenlining the economy, that is our way of attempting, one of the ways that we attempt to disrupt policy and disrupt, the status quo. And so we kind of tapped into this a little bit with the earlier conversation, but I'm curious to hear, in your work or in your personal lives or in, with your activist hats or professional hats or whatever it might be, what are the ways that you are each individually disrupting policy? And so it sounds like some answers already came up, but curious to hear, if there are either current examples or ideas that are floated out there that you think would be really great to continue to push for to disrupt policy. So I will start with Rawan, if that's okay, but feel free to pass the potato over to whoever you want.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. I'll just briefly say, I think with my greenlining hat on, the work that I do is really to push the private sector to care, and not just to, write that they're for racial equity on their website, but to put their money and their funds directly where the community needs it. And so even bringing community organizations, nonprofits that are led by people of color to the table with executives of banks and other corporations, and telling them, you're not adequately serving our organization or our communities, and what can you do, and holding them to that. So that looks like, protesting outside of their doors if they're not adequately, funding organizations, if they're not providing products and services like loans or grants to organizations. That's kind of one of the things that I'm doing, I guess, that I think just kind of focusing on the private sector is really important, since we know that our community investments need to be funded by something. And I have other ideas for how it should be funded, but that's just one of the things that I do with my greenlining hat.
That's great. No, thank you. And so it sounds like one of those ways to disrupt is accountability, right? So I'm curious to hear if there are other disruptful ways to hold folks accountable. So I'll start over to you, Destiny, again, if that's okay.
Yeah, I kind of cut my teeth on having a disruptive presence, right? And so I think a lot of times, because I grew up in a civil service family, I also grew up in a community organizing family. And, that was my aspiration. And I realized that although that's a powerful, position to be in, a civil servant, unless you are willing to be disruptive in that space, it's not really helpful. And so I think that was one of my earliest sort of epiphanies about how to be disruptive. But I think where we are now, personally and at the Thrivance Group, is really unpacking the co-conspiratory relationships and dynamics that exist between civic agencies or civil service agencies. And I say that because it's really hard to leverage accountability or to call folks out, as we would say, if no one is acknowledging the piece of the sky that they hold up. And so really unpacking and untangling what seems like a messy net, a web of relationships. For example, the romance that DOTs and police departments has needs to be exposed. I think even more so than we realize today. But I also think about our children's and youth services departments, the DCSFs of the world, and how they are housed in juvenile justice courts. So just because a child is in foster care, they are born into criminalization. And all of these things work together, right, to create the revelations that we saw in Sonrisa's, the maps that she put up, right? And at the Thrivance Group, we use a term called purple lining because we need to add more colors to the narrative. But we talk about purple lining, which is the role of transportation planning's, their invisible hand in all of the disparity that we see showing up on that map. And so I think the disruption is, instead of us as people of color being willing to navigate the world behind the veil that Du Bois told us about with double consciousness, stepping out from behind our veil and also taking the veil and the cloak of white supremacy off of the agencies that are responsible for this. So that also is disruptive. And then also, lastly, I'll say, taking back the narrative and the language that these organizations are co-opting, right? That movement language comes from our struggle. It comes from the blood of our ancestors. I don't like that the word woke now has a negative connotation, right? So I think taking back our narratives and taking back our languages and renaming their processes, right? So it's not just urban planning, it's community-based planning. It's not just, transportation planning. It's freedom of movement. It's liberated navigation through space, right? Like Black futurism is a planning focus area too. And so really thinking about how we step into that space, willing to undo what's there and recreate or imagine anew what it should be in our interest.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And that made me actually reflect a little bit about, everyone here on this panel is a woman of color. And sometimes, as women and as women of color who enter spaces that are white-led and male-oriented, I feel like sometimes just stepping into that space is disruptive just by your sheer presence. And I myself have had to do a lot of code switching, right? Back and forth between who I speak to and how I communicate, and leveraging white supremacy in some ways, right, to capitalize that, but then also reminding folks of, who we're here to actually serve. And so I'm curious, Yana, in the space that you work in at the state and being a Latina and a woman of color, what are all the ways that you feel, you've already been able to and will continue to disrupt policy?
Start by saying that I just think the formal government space, as some of you know, Dr. Thomas, you obviously know, is a really interesting and dynamic place to try to disrupt. And I do think it's safe to say you are somewhat limited in your ability to truly dismantle and disrupt, because you're operating within the confines of an institution in many respects. But to answer your question, I feel like I almost want to separate my personal self, my personal experience from some of this, which maybe I shouldn't do, because there's a lot there. Just from quickly from a personal standpoint, it is exhausting work. It's just really, really exhausting. There are some ways in which small successes have to be what you hang on to, making kind of incremental progress, incremental change. But as we know, given the catastrophic crisis that we've seen, the ongoing crisis that we are seeing, incremental change only gets us so far, and it can be really frustrating to have to rely on and bank on that. One of the conversations that we're having currently, I think, just in the in the context of recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, but also building resilience capacity and to an extent assessing recovery needs, including future recovery needs from things like wildfires and climate-related disasters, is the extent to which it really should be on government agencies to flat out write checks. Like, we need to be supporting through resource investments, as you all were mentioning, people of color-led organizations, community-based partners, tenants, water ratepayers, everybody who's been harmed by the COVID-19 pandemic and who continues to be harmed by climate change on an ongoing basis. And that's a really difficult conversation to have with government agencies. You know, there's always so much hesitance to loosen up the purses for individual residents, for communities, for taxpayers, when there's far more willingness to do so for coalitions of industry groups, developers, et cetera. And so navigating that space, I think, has been one of the ways in which we've been able to disrupt a bit. We still have so far to go. So I'm just like hesitant to even say that it's, you know, true disruption, because I see the goalpost as still being so far away. But that's one way. And then I think, unfortunately, largely due to Prop 209 and just the chill effect that it has created across public entities, simply talking about race seems to be a disruption. And that has been a particularly exhausting place to work in and space to work in, because you know, it's tiring to be satisfied with incremental progress in that space as well. But I think it's a good intersection where, you know, folks on the inside that are really seeing how the missing link of being able to prioritize our investments based on race, based on historical you know, patterns that have led to systemic racism affecting particular communities, each individually, like the inability to talk about that and to prioritize based on that is a hindrance to our ability to really make effective policy change. And so I think what we need is a coupling of champions on the inside, movement builders on the outside, like we need to get rid of Prop 209. Like, we have to get rid of it. It's such a hindrance to our ability to really make change. So I guess that's another example.
No, that's great. Thank you. And it kind of, you know, if redlining and blockbusting and restrictive covenants were all actively racist, then the antidote would be actively anti-racist policy, right? And so you would think it would just be pretty clear, but we have a long way to go. So I want to give an opportunity to audience members to join the conversation. And I'm being told that we have someone, a brave soul, in the queue. But before we bring you up here, I wanted to just go ahead and lay out some ground rules. So first, again, remember, this is going to be a fun, casual conversation. So share your comments, your thoughts with any of us, and don't hop off right away, right? Stay, relax, hang out, and see where the conversation goes. We'll have a couple of minutes, and then I'll go ahead and prompt you to queue off. Secondly, please be respectful of our panelists and all guests here, and remember to stay on topic, right? We're here to talk about racial equity. And lastly, for all of y'all who are not comfy joining the queue and getting up here on stage, I know I probably wouldn't if I wasn't voluntold. Please go ahead and use the chat and the Q&A function and interact with us that way. So with that, I'll go ahead and ask our behind the scenes folks to bring up our first audience member. See, hopefully this works. It's an experiment, so we'll see. Okay, well, while Mariah helps us bring up the first audience member, I want to go ahead and read the third question since we're running close to time, and it actually ties in really well with the way that we ended up the last conversation. So, you know, in preparation for this session and also the policy, the building power session, we realize that a theme in making sure, as you mentioned, Jana, that both of these tools actually work in tandem for true change means that we also have to consider timelines, right? We have to consider the urgency of the moment, and then also what the long-term goals are going to be for true systemic change. So I'm curious to hear from all of you, and I'll go ahead and pick on one of you in a little bit. How can we sustain both immediate recovery, but then also long-term reconstruction, right? To Destiny's point, if we're going to completely dismantle the system, how do we sustain both in the short term and the long term? So it's kind of a layered question, but while we have someone go ahead and join us in the conversation, I'll turn it over to Rawan to see if he can guide us through this one.
Thanks, Leslie. I think, so I'm going to go back to the Greenline Economy Guidebook, because I think those standards really help us, I think, moving forward. The work that I do is like really immediate, like how can we access capital? How can we invest in a specific community development project? But really, we're trying to systemically change for me specifically, the financial services industry, so that it actually is meeting the needs of communities, and that it is prioritizing recovery and wealth building rather than being kind of an extractive industry. So those standards, I think, to me are to emphasize anti-racist solutions, to deliver intentional benefits, to establish paths towards wealth building, and to prioritize multi-sector approaches. And another, I think, point that I want to emphasize, and something that we're also working on at Greenlining, is to require the state legislator to assess, any bill moving forward based on the impact that it has on communities of color, right? So that we don't have something like Prop 209 or other laws that are really inhibiting us from moving forward. Any bill that goes through the legislature should be assessed for its potential impact on communities of color, and it should be done proactively rather than kind of having to pass. So I think that's another key point when we think about moving forward.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, thank you. And I know that, we all have worked really hard in making sure that we use the Greenline, the economy standards as a filter for policy moving forward. Yeah, Destiny, I wonder, if you have thoughts on how to sustain this short-term recovery and then long-term reconstruction, particularly in some of the thoughts around, dismantling and being an urbanist.
Yeah, so I believe deeply in transformative justice as an overarching set of principles and values that really do, I think, already give us the blueprint for reparative policy making. And so in that work, we talk about always focusing on immediate relief from suffering first, right? So stopping the harm, particularly for people who have been experiencing harm for the longest amounts of times and at deeper levels. And then moving toward conversations about what it means to be a bystander in this field, and also what it means to be sort of the implementer or the influential person in this field, right? And everyone has their unique role in that process. But I think, what transformative justice offers us as a framework is truly a path forward where the people who've experienced the harm get to self-determine what it looks like to be made whole. So there's that. And then I also think that on a very serious note, a lot of times, which this is valid, when we talk about how to meet the immediate economic needs of Black and Brown communities, we are asking people to take on more education. We are asking them to sign up for hard manual labor jobs to help get us out of whatever the climate is or the crises that we're facing, whether it's a climate crisis or the pandemic. We're not having enough conversations about how to make entrepreneurs out of people who would otherwise not have access to income. We are not having these large municipal agencies seriously consider small businesses, Black-owned businesses, brown businesses, indigenous businesses for the larger projects that the mega firms bid on. And even at the federal level, I think it's great the priorities that are being put on the table, particularly from Secretary Pete. But I think what's missing from that, again, is there's no complementary pathway to get the folks who deserve those opportunities to those opportunities, right? We want to build back better this year. That means we're going to have to relax a lot of the eligibility requirements and certification processes that have made it so that folks like myself took me 15 years to get into the field, or to at least get the visibility that I have in it now, right? And so we've got to get rid of the barriers immediately and be willing to say, you know, Mama Jackson from, you know, Baton Rouge, although she didn't go to planning school and doesn't have a PhD, she probably has the oral history and the institutional knowledge that gets us to a more sustainable outcome here. And she should be certified as such. She should be allowed to be a civil service employee as well. So I think looking at our hiring practices, because you could pass revolutionary policy, and we've already seen that happen. But it's the implementers that continue to undermine our progress. So again, disruption. We need to rethink what leadership looks like too.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And I think that, you know, that's ultimately when we finally get to a point, I'd say, right, when we want to design policy and target it for communities in mind, we often don't do the community outreach. We don't go back and ask them, what do you need? What do you want? Do you even want this in the first place? And I think that that's a really big, important issue in policy. So yeah, Yana, I don't know if in your work you've seen some of these similar barriers, and any thoughts on, you know, how to get us in the short term and long term goals.
Absolutely. I think just to highlight a point that both Rawan and Destiny, I think, made around implementation and how critical implementation really is. Like, I think, as you mentioned, Leslie, you know, checking in with communities about, on the front end, is this a policy that serves your needs, but also, is this implementation process now still working? Like, what do we need to tweak? I think we're often really quick to design new policy initiatives and new, particularly, you know, where I sit in Sacramento, new legislative prerogatives without consistently circling back and understanding whether the implementation process is truly serving the need and the purpose that the policy was trying to serve at the outset. And so I think that's an important piece of just building, kind of sustaining that momentum over time. And then this is kind of like weird probably for me to be saying as someone serving in a government agency right now, but for this to be the focus, I think over the past couple of years, particularly throughout 2020, for so many of us, really looking inward at the importance of our own sustenance and our own strength, and like where that comes from. And that's a journey that's so personal to everyone. And I also think for communities of color, like we have such a resilience in our history, in our community, in our ancestry. And so really being able to tap into that, I think is a piece of what helps us sustain this energy over time, that we're also starting to talk about more, and that I think has been really refreshing, and also leads us to understanding different types of knowledge and expertise, and grounding ourselves in you know, a level of disruption that could look really different than what we have. So I think it's also important to recognize that sort of like personal component.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate you saying that, Yana, because I think that, you know, and again, I'll speak from personal experience. At first, it's really tempting to just kind of want to shy in the back of a classroom, or in the back of a meeting, or in the back of, you know, public comments. But then once you tap into, you know, this knowledge and this like cultural history that you know that you have, and that you know that you're there to bring a purpose to, I think it starts to open up doors, and people actually do start to listen. But it takes a lot to get to that point for sure. We're getting close to time. We have 4 minutes left before Sonrisa closes us out. And so I do want to ask a round robin question. And I don't know, hopefully, I think 4 minutes is enough time. So, yesterday we talked a lot about within Isabel Wilkerson's talk, how we can continue this momentum, what it would look like to actually instill reparations in our society, and what the first step might be. And she mentioned, education and making sure that, all folks understand this history of the suffering that everyone has had to, or people of color have had to endure. And so for my round robin question, I'm curious to hear, if we get outside of this box and tap into our radical imaginations, what would be like your dream policy that would, for recovery? What would be your dream recovery policy that could totally be implemented and sustained? So I'll give you all like a little tiny bit to think about this one. I'm looking at the queue, and we didn't have any takers today. We didn't have any brave souls sign up to join us in conversation, but I hope that you all did tap into the chat and the Q&A function. And if in the last 2 minutes you want to come up and answer this round robin question with us, please feel free to do so. Okay, so let's see, who would like to answer that first? Destiny? Okay, go ahead.
This is a conversation I've actually been having with my mother since I was 14. I remember doing back of the envelope math on what it costs to house a person, including considering inflation. And there are very small minor tweaks that cities, especially the larger cities, can make to their annual budgets that would really facilitate us housing everyone in the city permanently for free. And so I think if we're having a radical conversation, really thinking about decommodifying housing and taking that on as like a priority, a policy priority. I mean, of course, the argument or case would be difficult to make for everyone because we are living in a capitalist society. But I think when you add a layer of analysis that's based on reparations, these answer in terms of who should get permanent free housing becomes really clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we got 1 minute left. So between Rawan and Yana.
I love that, Destiny. I'll just jump in really quickly and maybe we can get to you, Rawan. I would love to see like a comprehensive land back policy at the federal and state level, particularly for public lands, federally administered forested lands, and state parks and lands, to really acknowledge the need to repurpose lands to Indigenous people, and see what that level of stewardship could do for our climate, for our environment, for access for all of us. So a comprehensive land back policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Rawan, you got 10 seconds.
We need to cut military spending so that we can prioritize resources for community wealth. It's the only way. And police and military spending.
Those are all great. Thank you so much. Yeah. And I really hope that we get to see a future where all of these are actually implemented, because that would be, hopefully we'd be out of jobs by then, ideally. Great. Well, I'm just going to wait a little bit for Sonrisa to cue us out, and thank you all so much for joining us today. I super appreciated this conversation. I hope you enjoyed your time on my little late night talk show. And thank you again for joining Greenlining's Summit this year. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all for joining us today. We had some really incredible conversations in both of those breakout sessions. This was fantastic. I just want to give a shout out to our incredible moderators, Brianna Wells and Leslie Aguayo, for leading these fantastic conversations. Thank you to our guests, Yana Garcia, Destiny Thomas, Alberto Ratana, and Michelle Mascareñas Swan, for sharing their brilliance with us. And to our Greenlining staff members, Emmy Wang and Rawan Elhalaby, for joining our guests up on stage. And of course, a huge thank you and round of applause to all of you in the audience today. especially the brave souls out there who joined the roundtables with our speakers. I hope you leave this virtual room feeling like you learned something new and that you feel ready to take a big step into the work of building a just and healthy economy together. Next, we're going to take a break where DJ Ome will be playing music. And then I hope you'll join us for the final session of this conference where our Vice President of Policy, Alvaro Sanchez, will be moderating a conversation with Angela Glover-Blackwell and Michael Tubbs about radically reimagining our future and transforming our society to one that delivers true racial equity. It's going to be a great conversation. So thank you again for joining, and see you in the closing plenary session.